Step into the darkness, where whispers linger in the shadows and echoes of the past refuse to fade. Tonight, 4 haunting tales will unravel before you. Stories of madness, guilt, and the inescapable grip of fate. Listen closely, but be warned. Some shadows stretch farther than we can see, and some whispers never fade away. Now, close your eyes and let the story begin. The Pit and the Pendulum. I was sick unto death from that long agony. When they finally unbound me and allowed me to sit, I felt my senses slipping away. The last thing I heard clearly was the dreaded sentence of death. After that, the voices of the Inquisitors blurred into a distant, dreamlike hum. It reminded me of the monotonous drone of a mill wheel, only for a moment, though, before all sound faded completely. Yet for a while, I could still see, though in a terrifyingly exaggerated way. I saw the black-robed judge's lips. They seemed unnaturally white, even whiter than this very page on which I write. Their thinness bordered on grotesque, stretched by an expression of unshakable firmness, of unyielding resolve, of pitiless contempt for human suffering. I saw those lips still shaping what, to me, were the decrees of fate. They twisted into a dreadful articulation, forming the syllables of my name. Yet no sound followed, and I shuddered at the silence. For a brief, delirious moment, I noticed the nearly imperceptible movement of the black draperies covering the walls. Then my eyes fell upon 7 tall candles on the table. At first, they seemed like pure, slender angels, symbols of mercy that might save me. But suddenly, a wave of nausea swept over me. My entire body trembled, as if I had touched a live electric wire. The angelic forms warped into meaningless specters with heads of fire. I knew then there would be no salvation from them. And then, like the softest note of a distant melody, a thought crept into my mind. The thought of the peaceful rest that must come in the grave. It came gently, stealthily, growing in my consciousness until I fully grasped it. But just as I surrendered to its embrace, the judge's figures vanished, as if by magic. The tall candles flickered out, swallowed into nothingness. Darkness, absolute and consuming, engulfed everything. Sensations collapsed into a wild, rushing descent, as if my soul were being hurled into the abyss of Hades. Then came silence, stillness. Night became the universe. I had fainted, but I will not say that my consciousness was entirely lost. Some part of it lingered, though I cannot define or describe it. Even in the deepest slumber, no. In delirium, no. In a swoon, no. In death, no. Even in the grave, something remains. Otherwise, how could there be immortality for man? When waking from the deepest sleep, we often break free from the fragile threads of a dream, only to forget we ever dreamed at all. So too, in returning from a fainting spell, the mind passes through 2 stages. First, a mental or spiritual awareness, and second, the physical awareness of existence. If we could retain the memories of that first stage, perhaps they would reveal the secrets of the void beyond. And what is that void? How can we distinguish its shadows from those of the tomb? Even if we do not recall them at will, do they not return unbidden, mysterious echoes from some forgotten place? He who has never swooned cannot understand. He does not see strange palaces in glowing embers, nor find in the air visions too sorrowful for others to perceive. He does not pause over the scent of an unfamiliar flower, nor feel his mind unravel at the sound of a melody never before heard. Often I struggled to remember, to reclaim some fragment of the nothingness in which my soul had been lost. At times, I thought I had succeeded. Brief, fleeting moments teased me with vague recollections, but reason in clearer hours assured me these memories could only belong to that strange state of unconsciousness. They whispered of silent figures lifting me, carrying me downward, down, ever down, until sheer dizziness overtook me at the thought of such an endless descent. They spoke of a cold terror in my heart, made worse by the unnatural stillness of that heart. Then all at once, movement ceased, as if those who carried me, this ghastly procession, had reached the very edge of the infinite and could go no farther. Then I remember only dampness beneath me, and after that, nothing but madness, a madness obsessed with things that should never be recalled. Suddenly, motion and sound rushed back into my awareness. The wild pounding of my heart, the deafening beat in my ears. Then a moment of complete blankness. Then again, sensation, sound, movement, touch. A tingling spread through my body. I became aware of my existence, yet without thought. This state lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly, came thought. Shuddering terror, a frantic attempt to understand where I was, a desperate wish to slip back into unconsciousness, but then a surge of will, a successful effort to move, and with it a flood of memory, the trial, the judges, the black draperies, the sentence, the sickness, the swoon, but nothing beyond that. Everything that had followed was lost to me, except for the vague fragments I would later struggle to recall. Until now, I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I was lying on my back, unbound. Cautiously, I reached out my hand, and it landed heavily on something damp and solid. I let it rest there for a long time as I tried to understand where I was. I wanted, yet feared, to see. It was not the sight of horrors I dreaded, but the possibility that there would be nothing at all to see. At last, driven by a desperate impulse, I opened my eyes. My worst fears were confirmed. I was engulfed in a darkness deeper than night. I gasped for air. The blackness felt thick, pressing in on me, suffocating. The air was stifling, unbearably close. I lay still, forcing myself to think rationally. I recalled the trial, the sentence, and tried to reason through my situation. How much time had passed? It felt like an eternity, but I knew I was not dead. Such a notion, despite what fiction might suggest, was absurd. I could think. I could feel. But where was I? Those condemned to death by the Inquisition usually perished in the auto da fe. One had taken place on the very night of my trial. Had I been thrown back into a dungeon to await another execution months later? Number that was impossible. The Inquisition needed its victims immediately. Besides, the dungeons of Toledo had stone floors, and some light always crept into them. A sudden, dreadful realization struck me. My heart pounded violently, and I collapsed once more into unconsciousness. When I came to, I sprang to my feet, every nerve in my body trembling. Frantically, I stretched my arms in every direction, reaching, searching, nothing. The emptiness terrified me even more than walls would have. Sweat poured from my body, cold and heavy. The uncertainty became unbearable, and I forced myself to move forward, arms outstretched, eyes straining for even the faintest glimmer of light. Step after step, and still nothing. Only blackness. Only silence. Then at last, a small relief. I was not buried alive in a tomb. awaited me, it was not the worst imaginable. As I cautiously stepped forward, my mind filled with dreadful whispers of Toledo's infamous dungeons. I had always dismissed them as exaggerations, fables too ghastly to be real. But now, in the suffocating darkness, those whispered horrors felt disturbingly plausible. Was I to die here, starving in this underground void? Or was an even crueler fate in store for me? That death awaited me, I had no doubt. The only mystery was how and when. At last, my outstretched hands met something solid, a wall. It was smooth, damp, and deathly cold, likely made of stone. I traced it carefully, taking slow, wary steps, recalling ominous stories I'd once read. But the wall revealed nothing. It was so perfectly uniform that I could walk its entire perimeter and return to my starting point without realizing it. I instinctively reached for the knife that had been in my pocket when I stood before the Inquisitors, but it was gone. My clothing had been replaced with a rough, coarse robe. I needed a way to mark my starting point, to ensure I wasn't walking in endless circles. An idea struck me. I could wedge my knife into a crack in the masonry. But without a knife, I had to improvise. I tore a strip from the hem of my robe and placed it against the wall, hoping I would find it again when I completed the circuit. Confident in my plan, I pressed on, but I had underestimated the size of my prison and my own exhaustion. The ground was slick with moisture, and after walking for what felt like an eternity, I stumbled and collapsed. Too weary to rise, I let sleep overtake me where I lay. When I awoke, I reached out blindly and felt something beside me, a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. I was too weak to question how they had appeared. I devoured the meal hungrily, then resumed my exploration. After great effort, I finally found the fragment of cloth I had placed, confirming that I had completed a full circuit. I had taken 52 paces before falling, then 48 more afterward, 100 paces in total. Assuming 2 paces made a yard, my dungeon was roughly 50 yards in circumference. But something troubled me. I had encountered many angles in the wall, making it impossible to determine the prison's true shape. It felt less like a dungeon and more like a vast, formless vault. I had no real purpose, certainly no hope, in continuing my exploration. It was a vague curiosity that drove me onward. Leaving the wall, I decided to cross the open space of my prison. At first, I moved with extreme caution, as the floor, though solid beneath my feet, was slick with slime. Eventually, I gained confidence and began walking more steadily, aiming to move in as straight a line as possible. I had taken 10 or 12 steps when my feet became tangled in the torn hem of my robe. Before I could react, I tripped and fell forward violently. In the disorienting moment of my fall, I didn't immediately register the strange sensation beneath me. But as I lay sprawled on the ground, something peculiar caught my attention. My chin rested against the cold stone floor, but my lips and the upper part of my head touched nothing. A damp, clammy vapor clung to my forehead, and the unmistakable stench of decayed fungus filled my nostrils. Dread creeping through me, I extended my arm and shuddered. I had fallen at the very edge of a deep, circular pit. Its size was unknown, but I knew that had I taken just one more step, I would have plunged into its depths. Carefully, I groped along the stone rim, pried loose a small fragment, and let it drop. For long seconds, I listened as it tumbled down, striking the walls again and again. Finally, a dull splash echoed up from below, followed by reverberations that made my skin crawl. At that same moment, I heard a sudden noise, a sharp creak, like the swift opening and closing of a door above me. A faint beam of light slashed through the darkness, flickered for an instant, and vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I understood then the fate that had been planned for me, and I realized how narrowly I had escaped it. One more step, and I would have disappeared forever. The death that awaited me was not one of swift execution, but a slow, calculated horror, the kind I had once dismissed as mere superstition in the grim stories of the Inquisition. Their victims were given a choice, a death of unspeakable physical agony, or a death of sheer mind-shattering terror. I had been chosen for the latter. My long ordeal had already weakened me, eroding my nerves until I trembled at the sound of my own voice. I had become the perfect subject for their cruel designs. Shaking uncontrollably, I felt my way back to the wall, resolving to die there rather than risk the hidden wells of death, my imagination now placed all around me. In another state of mind, I might have had the courage to end my suffering by throwing myself into one of those pits. But now I was a coward of the worst kind. Worse still, I could not forget what I had read about these infernal chasms. Their horror did not lie in the swiftness of death, but in something far worse. The torment of my thoughts kept me awake for what felt like endless hours. But exhaustion overcame me at last, and I slept. When I awoke, just as before, I found a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water beside me. My throat burned with thirst, and I drained the vessel in one desperate gulp. The effect was immediate. A heavy drowsiness overtook me, irresistible and unnatural. The water had been drugged. I sank into a deep, death-like sleep. How long I remained unconscious, I could not tell. But when I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in total darkness. A strange, sulphurous glow, its source unknown, illuminated my surroundings, revealing the prison's true form. I had been gravely mistaken about its size. The entire circumference of the dungeon was no more than 25 yards. At first, this realization occupied my thoughts, though I quickly realized how absurd it was to fixate on such a trivial detail under such dreadful circumstances. And yet, my mind clung to it. I puzzled over my miscalculation until at last the truth struck me. During my first attempt to explore, I had counted 52 steps before I collapsed. I must have fallen just short of the strip of cloth I had placed. In reality, I had nearly completed the circuit of the vault. When I awoke, still disoriented, I had retraced my steps in the opposite direction, without realizing it, leading me to believe the dungeon was twice its actual size. In my confusion, I had failed to notice a simple fact. I had begun my exploration with the wall to my left, but ended with it on my right. I had also been deceived about the shape of my prison. As I felt my way in the dark, I had encountered several angles, leading me to believe the enclosure was irregular. But total darkness plays strange tricks on the mind. The angles were nothing more than shallow indentations at uneven intervals. In reality, the room was square. What I had mistaken for stone walls now appeared to be iron, or another metal, formed from massive plates. The seams where the plates joined had created the depressions I had felt earlier. Every inch of this metallic surface was defaced with crude and grotesque images, ghastly remnants of the monks' macabre superstitions. Fiendish figures leered at me, their skeletal forms twisted in menacing poses. Other horrors, more indescribable, crowded the walls. Though their outlines remained clear, the colors were smeared and faded, likely from the dampness in the air. Then I turned my attention to the floor. It was solid stone, and at its center yawned the pit, the same pit that had nearly swallowed me. I now saw that it was the only one in the dungeon. I took all this in with difficulty, for my condition had changed drastically since I last awoke. I was no longer free. I lay on my back, stretched out on a low wooden platform. A thick strap, like a harness, coiled tightly around my body, binding my limbs in multiple loops. Only my head and my left arm had any movement, just enough for me to reach the food placed beside me on the floor. Then, to my horror, I realized something was missing, the pitcher of water. My throat burned with an unbearable thirst, and I knew this was no oversight. My captors intended it. The food they had left for me was spiced and heavily seasoned, meant to inflame my thirst even further. Forcing my mind away from my suffering, I looked up. The ceiling loomed 30 or 40 feet above, constructed of the same metallic material as the walls. But what caught my attention was a painting, a figure of time depicted as he usually is, except in place of a scythe. He held what at first glance appeared to be a giant pendulum, like those seen in old clocks. There was something unsettling about it. As I gazed at the figure, I thought, just for an instant, that I saw the pendulum move. A moment later, I realized I had not imagined it. The blade was swinging, slowly, deliberately. I watched for several minutes, fascinated more than afraid. But when the motion became monotonous, I turned my eyes back to my surroundings. I should have kept watching. A faint noise caught my attention. Looking down, I saw several enormous rats scurrying across the floor. They had emerged from the well just within my line of sight. Even as I watched, more poured out, moving in swarms, their ravenous eyes fixed on the scent of the meat left beside me. It took all my effort to keep them at bay. Time passed. Half an hour, perhaps an hour. I could no longer measure it accurately. Eventually, I looked up again. What I saw filled me with shock and horror. The pendulum's arc had grown significantly, nearly a yard wider than before. Its speed had also increased, but the most terrifying realization was that it had descended, closer now than ever. I could see its form in awful detail. The bottom edge was a curved blade of glittering steel, about a foot wide from tip to tip. The edges faced upward, and the underside gleamed with the deadly sharpness of a razor. Like a razor, too, it was thick and heavy, tapering from the cutting edge into a solid, broad mass above. It was attached to a heavy brass rod, and as it swung through the air, it hissed, a sound that made my blood run cold. There was no longer any doubt. The monks who devised these tortures had prepared a specific fate for me. They knew I had discovered the pit reserved for those bold enough to defy them. That terrible chasm rumored to be the ultimate punishment, the very mouth of hell. By sheer accident, I had avoided falling into it, and their methods relied on surprise, on trapping their victims in elaborate, grotesque executions. Since I had not fallen, absurdity of calling such a fate mild. What use is there in describing the endless, excruciating hours of horror I endured, counting each swing of the descending blade? Inch by inch, line by line, it crept downward, its movement so slow it seemed to take an eternity. Days may have passed, perhaps many days. Then at last, the pendulum swung so near that I could feel its acrid breath against my skin. The metallic scent of sharpened steel filled my nostrils. I prayed, desperately, endlessly, for the blade to fall faster and end my torment. My mind snapped under the weight of terror. In a fit of madness, I struggled upward, pressing toward the scything arc of the descending death. Then, without warning, a strange calm overtook me. I stopped fighting. I lay still, gazing at the shimmering steel with a vacant, almost childlike fascination, like a child staring in wonder at a rare toy. Again, I lost consciousness. This time, it was brief. When I awoke, I saw that the pendulum had not moved any lower. But had time passed, I could not tell. I suspected my tormentors had seen me swoon and deliberately halted its descent. They controlled its motion. I felt sick, an inexpressible, hollow sickness, as if my body had been drained of all strength. And yet, even amid my suffering, the most basic human instinct returned: hunger. With great effort, I stretched my left arm as far as my bindings allowed, grasping the last scraps of food the rats had left me. As I lifted a morsel to my lips, something flickered in my mind, a half-formed thought. Joy. Hope. But why should I feel hope? The thought was incomplete, vague, and before I could grasp it, it vanished. I struggled to bring it back, to understand, but my mind was too shattered. Too much suffering had drained my reason. I had become nothing. A shadow. A hollow thing. The pendulum swung perpendicular to my body, its blade positioned over my heart. I understood its design. It would begin by slicing the fabric of my robe. Then, stroke by stroke, it would carve deeper and deeper. Its terrifying width, 30 feet or more, made its approach seem slow, but its sharpness was beyond question. At this thought, I froze. I dared not think beyond this simple fact. My mind fixated on a single, absurd detail, the way the blade would sound as it sliced through my robe. The faint shivering rasp of fabric tearing, the odd tingling sensation of cloth brushing against skin. I clung to these trivialities as if, by thinking only of them, I could stop the blade from descending further. I fixated on them so completely that my teeth began to ache. Down, steadily, relentlessly, it crept. I became obsessed with its motion. I took a feverish pleasure in comparing its two movements. Its side-to-side arc was wild, erratic, shrieking through the air like a damned soul. But its descent was quiet, deliberate, like a stalking tiger. At times, I laughed hysterically. Other times, I howled in terror. My mind reeled between these two extremes. Down, certainly, inevitably down. The blade now hovered within 3 inches of my chest. Desperation seized me. I thrashed, trying to free my left arm. It was bound tightly, but only from the elbow up. My forearm and hand still had movement. I could just barely reach the platter of food beside me, but nothing more. If only I could break the strap at my elbow. I could seize the pendulum itself, but it was useless. I might as well have tried to stop an avalanche. Down, still descending, still mercilessly descending. I gasped and fought against my restraints with each vibration of the blade. I flinched, convulsing at every downward sweep. My eyes tracked its movement obsessively, darting back and forth as it swung outward, squeezing shut in horror as it fell closer to my chest. And yet, despite my agony, I still trembled with hope. It was hope that made me recoil at each sweep. Hope that made my body shudder at the thought of how little it would take. Just a slight shift in the machinery for the blade to finally cut into me. It was hope, the cruelest thing of all. The same hope that lingers in the minds of the tortured. The hope that whispers even to the condemned, even in the deepest dungeons of the Inquisition. I calculated that in 10, perhaps 12 more swings, the blade would slice through my robe. With this realization, a strange calmness settled over me, a sharp, focused clarity born of pure despair. For the first time in hours, perhaps even days, I thought. And in that moment of lucidity, I saw something. The strap that bound me, the surcingle, was unusual. It was not made of multiple cords, but was a single, continuous band. If the pendulum struck it, even once, the razor-sharp edge would cut it cleanly. I could then unwind it with my free hand. But the risk, oh, the terrifying risk. If I struggled too soon, if I moved at the wrong moment, the blade would not cut the strap. It would cut into me. Had my tormentors anticipated this possibility? Had they deliberately placed the strap in a way that would make escape impossible? A sickening doubt filled me, desperate for answers. I lifted my head just enough to glimpse my chest. My heart pounded as I saw the truth. The surcingle wrapped my body tightly, everywhere except directly beneath the path of the descending blade. I let my head drop back against the wooden frame. And then a spark, a flicker of thought. A moment ago, I had grasped at the shadow of an idea, an incomplete notion that had surfaced when I ate my last scrap of food. Now the thought came fully formed. It was weak, barely rational, a desperate, mad plan. But it was a plan nonetheless. With the last reserves of my strength, I forced myself to act. For hours, rats had swarmed the wooden frame that held me. They were fearless, ravenous, their red eyes glowing in the dim light. They had only waited for me to lie still, to become their feast. And I thought, what food have they found in the well? What have they been eating? They had devoured nearly everything. Despite my efforts to fend them off, the rats had consumed all but a few scraps of the meal left beside me. I had resorted to waving my hand over the platter in a ceaseless motion, a desperate attempt to keep them away. But eventually, the movement lost its effect. They grew bolder, their sharp teeth sinking into my fingers as they fought for the last remnants of food. Then an idea took hold. I gathered the greasy spice scraps that remained and rubbed them thoroughly into the strap binding me, coating it as much as I could reach. Then I lifted my hand from the floor and went utterly still. At first, the rats hesitated. The sudden lack of movement startled them. Many scurried back toward the well, wary of the change, but only for a moment. Their hunger was stronger than their fear. One by one, the boldest among them crept back, sniffing at the greasy bandage. That was all it took. A frenzy began. From the well, fresh swarms poured forth. They climbed the wooden frame, skittered across my chest, clung to my limbs, and swarmed over me in suffocating waves. Their cold bodies wriggled against my throat. Their lips, slick and hungry, pressed against my skin. I could barely breathe under the weight of them. Disgust beyond words filled me. A revulsion so deep it chilled my very soul. But I did not move. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to endure. I could feel it, the surcingle loosening. In multiple places, their gnawing teeth had already severed the fabric. I had not miscalculated. I had not suffered in vain. At last, I felt it. The strap gave way. I was free. But just as I began to shift, I felt the pendulum's blade graze my chest. It had already sliced through my robe. The linen beneath was cut. Twice more it swung, this time drawing blood. A sharp, searing pain shot through me. But my moment had come. With a single motion, I waved my arm. The rats scattered instantly, fleeing in all directions. With slow, careful movements, I slid from beneath the loosened straps, inching my way beyond the reach of the swinging blade. For the moment, at least, I was free. Free, but still in the grasp of the Inquisition. I had barely stepped onto the cold stone floor when the infernal machine halted. I watched as it was drawn upward, vanishing into the ceiling as if by some invisible hand. A grim lesson struck me at once. My every movement was being watched. Free? Hardly. I had merely escaped one form of death, only to face another. A deep, creeping unease settled over me. I scanned the iron walls that enclosed me, sensing something had changed. But what? At first, I couldn't tell. I drifted in a haze of confused, trembling thoughts, unable to grasp the significance of the shift. Then I noticed it. For the first time, I saw the source of the room's eerie glow. A thin fissure, no more than half an inch wide, ran along the base of the walls, circling the entire prison. The walls, it seemed, had separated completely from the floor. I crouched, trying to peer through the gap, but it was useless. Whatever lay beyond was hidden from me. And then the realization struck. I had noticed before that the figures painted on the walls, though distinct in outline, had appeared blurred, their colors faded. But now they were changing. Before my eyes, the colors deepened into an unnatural brilliance. The grotesque shapes contorted, their spectral faces twisted with new life. Demon eyes, hundreds, thousands of them, glared at me from all directions. They had not been there before. They glowed with an unholy light, staring, piercing, their fiery intensity, unlike anything I had ever seen, not an illusion. Even as I breathed, the truth became undeniable. The air filled with a suffocating heat, the stench of burning iron. The walls, I realized, were growing hotter. A sickly crimson light seeped into every painted horror, deepening the bloodstains, making them glisten as if freshly spilled. I gasped. I staggered back. I knew their plan. Oh, the cruelty, the inhumanity. I shrank toward the center of the room, away from the burning metal. My mind reeled. My lungs fought for breath. And then, like a whisper from the void, the thought came. The well, its darkness, its depth, its coolness, seemed almost inviting. I stumbled toward its edge, peering down into the abyss. The fiery glow from the walls now reached its depths, illuminating the void below. And for one long, excruciating moment, my mind refused to understand. But then it came, like fire. The truth seared into my reason. Oh, for a voice to scream. Oh, horror, horror beyond imagining. Oh, any fate but this. The heat intensified rapidly. I looked up, trembling violently. Another change had begun. At first, I could not comprehend what was happening, but I did not have to wonder for long. The Inquisitors had lost patience. I had evaded death twice, and now they would delay no more. The room, once square, was changing shape. Two of its corners were now sharp angles, while the others widened. The transformation was swift. A low, ominous rumbling filled the air as the chamber shifted. The square became a lozenge, and it did not stop there. I did not hope for it to stop. I did not want it to stop. I might have welcomed the burning walls, embraced them like a shroud, a release from this endless torment. Death, I whispered, any death but the pit. But fool that I was, I should have known. The walls were forcing me toward the abyss. There was no escape. I could not withstand their heat nor their pressure. The lozenge shape grew sharper, smaller, driving me step by step toward the gaping void. Faster now. No time to think. No time to resist. The widest part of the chamber now centered over the pit. I shrank back, but the walls gave me no choice. They pressed forward, relentless. Then, I felt my body teeter on the edge. There was no more ground beneath my heels. I had no more strength to struggle. A single, piercing scream tore from my soul as I fell. Then, a sound, voices, a discordant hum, rising and swelling. A blast of trumpets, loud, triumphant. A grating noise, thunderous, shattering. The burning walls rushed back. An arm, strong, firm, seized mine just as I plunged into the abyss. I fainted in that grasp. It was the arm of General LaSalle. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition had fallen. Had entered Toledo. The Inquisition had fallen. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope these whispered tales have brought you a sense of peace and relaxation. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. If you're ready for more tales, check out my other stories in the playlist linked below. Thank you for being part of this peaceful journey with me. Stay calm and come back soon for more whispered stories. Until next time, may your dreams be sweet and your sleep peaceful. Take care. And remember, I'll be here when you need another story to help you drift into a calm and restful slumber.